Welcome to Grounding Ascension, where we explore topics around activating and integrating our I am presence, coming back to our true selves. I am your host, Celeste Glus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grounding Ascension. I am so honored and excited to have a very special guest with us today. His name is Phil Borges, and he has an incredible amount of experience in spiritual awakening and being in the midst of shamans and healers and people who have experienced what we call a spiritual awakening, a spiritual quote unquote crisis. Just a little bit about Phil. He has over 25 years of documenting Indigenous and tribal cultures, striving to create an understanding of the challenges that they face. His work has been exhibited in museums and galleries all over the world, and he's written many award-winning books. I found Phil through one of his amazing movies, Crazy Wise, and it blew my mind. It really grounded my experience and it gave me a lot of hope as to where we are as a humanity and where we're going. So thank you, Phil, for doing that work, for being the amazing soul that you are. And yeah, I'd like to hand over the mic to you. And how would you like to start this? Do you want to give an intro of yourself and your work?
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, first of all. And one thing I just want to clear up is you said I have a lot of experience with spiritual emergency, and I do, but it's secondhand experience. I've interviewed many, many people that have gone through a psychological crisis or a spiritual emergency or whatever handle people want to put on it, going into non-ordinary states. But myself, I haven't. So I am very curious about it. And I know we were just talking a little bit about your experience before we came online here. And yeah, so any questions you have of me, what else can I add? Today I'm actually sitting down and looking at a manuscript. We started doing a book of my life experiences, a friend and I. And I just I just reviewed it in the last day or so for the first time. And it's amazing how much that entity I call myself changes in terms of my beliefs, my desires, my fears, my values over time. It's just like there isn't really any constant self. It's, as the Tibetan Buddhists say, it's an illusion, this idea that our self is this something separate from the whole. But that's what's on my mind right at this moment, because I just got through finishing that. But anyway, yes, anything that you want to talk about, I'm very anxious to talk.
Yeah, and I think it's so beautiful for you. Like you said, perhaps you haven't lived it, but you have this experience of having met so many people around the world in such incredible places, indigenous cultures, and you've actually given access to us in the Western world. At least for me, I would have never thought these people around the world are experiencing similar things, similar situations. So in a way, I guess the experience is, it is secondhand, but it's so powerful to be able to speak to these people and to be there face to face. And I know that you saw it. It started in Tibet. Do you want to talk a little bit about your first experience in Tibet?
Yeah, and that was, boy, almost 25 years ago now. But I decided I wanted to do a story on the Tibetan people. And I had heard how they had been taken over, their country had been taken over in 1949 when Mao invaded the country. And I heard more about what was going on there and the repression that was happening. So I just wanted to go over there and do a human rights story. and I end up in this very spiritual culture. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things, one of which was how differently the Dalai Lama was facing this. He lives in India now. He's lived in India in exile for almost 50 years. And how he was facing this takeover with his country. And I interviewed all these individuals who had been tortured and put in prison for protesting the occupation of their country. And while I was doing that, he gave a public address to all, which included a lot of the refugees I had interviewed. And in his address, he said something I'll never forget. Treat your enemies as if they were precious jewels, because it's your enemies, not your best friends, that are going to help you deepen your patience and your tolerance on the way to your own enlightenment. And I thought this is a very different way for a leader that usually uses anger and to come to power. So that started it. And then I was invited by a friend of mine to go and watch the Dalai Lama's oracle. And these people are called Kutins in the Tibetan language. People that can, what we would say, channel disembodied spirits. In this case, the spirit was the Nechung oracle, considered by the Tibetan people to be the protector spirit of the Tibetan people. So I was invited to watch this Kutin, who was a 30-year-old monk, go into trance. And in the small monastery where he was a monk, only about 40 other monks in the monastery. So it was a real intimate gathering, and they started chanting and beating their drums, and they put a big ceremonial hat on his head. His eyes rolled back, and he went into this trance, and he started talking in what sounded to me like a very different voice. He was speaking Tibetan, and the monks were writing down everything he was saying. And then he collapsed, and they had to carry him out of the room. And so I didn't know what to think. I thought, this could be a ceremonial theater production. It could be real. He could have, contacted some spirits. I didn't know. I was open to anything. But 2 days after my friend and I were in there, invited to see this, I got to interview him. And one of our questions was, how were you chosen to be a Kutin? And he described hearing voices, having I should say radical mood swings, personality changes. He thought he was dying. He had electrical jolts going up his spine. He said they felt like I was being electrocuted at times, which some people would now call a Kundalini experience. So I just thought it was interesting. He was describing things that in my country would often be diagnosed as a psychological crisis of some sort. So that was my first experience with coming across somebody like that. And while we were interviewing him, when he was just the 30-year-old monk, Tuptim Norbju is his name, he came across as this very sincere, he spoke a little bit of English, and very sincere young man that he wasn't, I could tell, he wasn't the type that would be putting on a show for somebody. And how, after that, they took him to the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama asked him, do you really want to become a Kutin? Because evidently it's a pretty hard life doing that work. And he said, yeah, I do. And he's I've interviewed him since that time down in Los Angeles. He has a temple in Los Angeles now. And he's 53 and very light, like the Dalai Lama, very light and funny. So yeah, that was my experience. And it was shortly after that I was doing another project in Kenya. And I came across in the Samburu tribe, which is up in northern Kenya. And I came across a woman there as I was going around telling a human rights story again. And she was known as a famous predictor in her tribe. Her name was Sakulan. She's the picture on the cover of the Crazy Wise logo. And she was the mother of 5 children. She was 37 years old. And she told me the story of when she was 14, starting to having visions and hearing voices. And her grandmother, and she was very frightened. She thought she was dying as well. And by the way, I've heard that from many of these shamans in different parts of the world, that thinking they were dying. And in fact, they call the process they go through the little death to become a shaman. They die to their old way of being and are born into a new way of being in the world. But anyway, her grandmother took her aside and said, you know, you've got a special sensitivity. It can be very valuable for the tribe. Yes, it's difficult. You can learn to manage your sensibilities, and she put her through an initiation of some sort, which I never did find out exactly what it was. But it just, that happened about 1.5 years after I'd met the Kutans. So all of a sudden I met 2 people that Sakulan's a very famous, what they call a predictor in the Samburu tribe, or a visionary, I would say, and a healer. So there were 2 people there that had the same story. So when I was doing my human rights work from then on, if I went into a village or a tribe, one of the first things I would ask is, who are your healers here? And so I could be able to interview them. And so I did that for the next 25 years.
That's amazing. And I want to ask you so many things on just what you just said. But first, I want to touch on the fact that it's your passion for human rights. I know before this, you were actually an orthodontist. So I love that you had the passion, the courage to go for what was inside your heart. So you were a human rights activist in your own right for your own life. But
Never thought of that.
I find it interesting that it's your passion for human rights is what has gotten you to explore this other side of life. And I almost feel a connection where it's a human right that we are now reclaiming, to be able to live this life and this experience for in my experience in my life, what I've lived, right? Because in our Western world, it's not a right. We're not allowed to live those things. And like I was saying before we came on here, it took a few years to wrap my mind and really get centered back into my life and into a regular life. And it's not really normal. It's not really accepted. And I feel that there's some kind of connection there with your passion with human rights and bringing in the fact that this is okay to be experienced and it's actually needed. Because if you want to share about how in all of your communities, like you just said, you would ask, who's the healer? I want to speak to the healer. And there was always one, correct?
Mm-hmm. And they always, almost all of them would go into alternate states of consciousness. I like to call it extraordinary states of consciousness to do their work. And many of them were identified in their youth by having a crisis. I'd say the majority of the people I talked to. And sometimes it was a physical crisis where they got very ill and almost died, but most often it was a mental emotional crisis, what I would call, where they were frightened because of their shift in their reality in terms of hearing things other people weren't hearing or seeing things other people weren't seeing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that goes to what you just mentioned about the death of the old self and having to experience that in this process, right? My experience was I was in a total car crash. I fell asleep at the wheel.
Mm.
But that didn't actually spark the spiritual awakening. It happened just shortly thereafter. It was like I was in a fast forward roller coaster in my life. And I
You
did,
had your spiritual awakening first, and then you had the car crash.
oh no, just the car crash first happened.
Oh, okay.
And then I remember actually waking up the next day from that car crash and not
Oh,
recognizing my body, not recognizing my life. And I
oh.
knew something had shifted.
Mm.
And just, I would say about a year later, I had this massive spiritual awakening and this process of the death and the rebirth, right?
Mm.
Leaving behind the old self, which what you just started this conversation with, right? Like there is no true self.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I've come to believe anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's such a,
I mean, in terms of being, in terms of being separate, you know, our self, what I call Phil Borges here, is just a series of narratives that I've been told or I've told myself over the years, and it's really a concept in my brain that isn't there when we are born. It's developed. A baby, a newborn, doesn't have that concept of the mother's breast being not them, or the mother's face not being not them, or whatever their first visions are. It's all them, and they're all one with it. And we, through our language and our enculturation, and that's different in different cultures, of course, build that separate ego sense, that separate ego self, which is a concept. It doesn't have any reality in and of itself. And but we need it to operate in this culture. It isn't like you can completely lose it, but it seems like people that go through an experience like you have get a glimpse of that unity at some point, of when that ego self is either partially disabled or disabled, and they get that sense of unity and oneness with everyone and everything. And as far as I can tell, after interviewing well over 100 people who have gone through this, and the ones that successfully navigated, they come out the other end with a lot more empathy and compassion because of that realization. So, yeah, the fact that so many people that go through it end up homeless, end up in jail, end up chemically incarcerated in a way with these heavy drugs. And I want to say also, which we said in the film, I'm not against medications. In a crisis, they can be very useful. As a long-term solution for somebody, not as good. They have a lot of very serious side effects, and it interrupts that process that wants to unfold, it seems, that wants to unfold in becoming, again, dying to your old self and becoming that new self.
yeah. And this sensation that you talk about, oneness, right? Being able to feel that it's beautiful and it's blissful. And at the same time, it can be one of the hardest things to navigate. One of my experiences, well, oftentimes was completely falling into the oneness state and the inability to really live a normal, grounded day-to-day life, because you almost lose the sense of what you just said. You lose the sense of self, And if there's no sense of me, Celeste, well, what's the point of living, right? And what's the point if everything is one and I'm just universal consciousness? And this division that naturally we need, it helps us identify and come together in our differences. It's something that's very hard to navigate. And when we add medications to it, oof, I mean, I know that you had interviews with people who have been on these medications, and yeah, how do you see a shift in the pharmaceutical side, or maybe the pharmacists that are giving these prescriptions? Do you see a shift happening?
It's usually the psychiatrists that give them,
Right.
in terms of prescribing them. Yeah, I do. I mean, first of all, it's not working very well in terms of, well, if you look at not only going into extraordinary states of consciousness like you did, if you look at depression, anxiety, addiction, all those other mental illnesses, quote unquote, their depression rates around the world are at an all-time high and accelerating. Suicide rates, especially amongst teenagers, are accelerating, up 24% in 10 years. I mean, it's horrible. And so they know the system as it isn't effective. You look at the physical side of medicine, and you know how we've conquered certain diseases with our antibiotics, and you know you can see all the progress there. We haven't seen that on the psychopharmaceutical side of things. Things are getting worse, not better. So they realize there's a problem. And I presented Crazy Wise at the American Psychiatric Association's annual convention in New York a couple of years ago. And of course, the people that were kind of open to, 13,000 people went to this convention, and I had a room that held 200 people. But so the people there were the people that were open to some of these ideas. But, the conversation after showing the film went on 3 hours. And it was mainly who's responsible for changing not misinformation, the untrue fact that mental illness is due to a chemical imbalance of the brain. And that's the way we are addressing it. Okay, you've got a chemical imbalance of the brain, so we have to rebalance that with these other chemicals. That paradigm has never been proven, and everybody knows it. If you went to the psychiatrist, I don't know if you did, but if you go in and to find out what's wrong, they're not going to take a blood sample or a spinal tap or anything physical. They're going to just ask you your symptoms and look at your behavior. That's it. Listen to what you're saying. So there's really no physical signs of somebody going into a crisis or somebody in depression, that sort of thing. Yes, after you've been in a state like that for 20 or 30 years, they'll see changes in the brain, but not when you're first going into it. So that whole paradigm is not only untrue, it's very, in my opinion, very harmful. Because if you're 20 years old, when most of these things happen, in the early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and adolescence, by the way. And you're away at college, you've flunked a test, or your girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with you, and you go into one of these states. and you're rushed to the emergency room and strapped down, either in an ambulance or in a police car, and shot up with drugs. And then when you're halfway conscious again, you're told you have a chemical imbalance of your brain. We don't have a cure for it now, but we can put you on these medications so you can lead a somewhat normal life. You can imagine how frightening that would be to somebody in that age group, and having their whole life ahead of them and realizing they've got a broken brain. And you're being told that by an expert. So that's just in the shamanic world, that would be like casting a spell on somebody. And the spell is you can't recover. You're going to live with this forever. You're going to be less than 100% functional. And so it's a very, not only untrue paradigm, it's a very damaging one.
Yeah, and especially at a time where all you need is just absolute support, right? I was sharing with you that luckily at the time of experiencing all of this, I had my husband with me. And for some reason, he fits the attributes that you said. You want somebody to be funny and laid back and not take life so seriously. And that's much of how he is. And completely supportive and open-minded through the whole process. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, I'm losing my mind. I just rather die. This is crazy. And so, yeah, it's at a time where you're so sensitive and so sensible, and like anything that is said to you, I mean, is like a stab in the heart, right? Just taken as your complete Bible and truth. It's intense. It's intense what's happening in the medical field. Can you share what you see in the communities, or what you've seen in the communities to support the process of these awakenings and these experiences?
In the tribal communities?
Yeah.
Well, in terms of what I saw in the communities, I saw that these individuals were very honored. The people that had gone through this experience years before, and now they were a respected healer or visionary in their community. They were just very honored, and people used them. I mean, for the problems they were having, the illnesses, and I don't know about the mental aspects of illnesses that they were addressing, but I know the physical. I saw many healings that were, many ceremonies that were done for healing of young kids and women in their pregnancy at one point. So what I can say about how the community is with those individuals is they're very honored and respected and relied upon. Now, there is an exception to this, and it happens mostly, I've seen it in the Amazon and the Ecuadorian Amazon specifically, where, and I saw it once in Kenya, where a person gets this power and misuses it. And they call it black magic. That's the common term for it in these areas. And I went into one village in Peru, and we were the first people into this part of Peru, first outsiders, first gringos in this little village in Peru. We went down this wild river to get there. And I was all excited to meet the shaman in this village. I was doing this program I was being the host for National Geographic. And we got to this village and we asked about the shaman, and they had all been killed because they started practicing that. And if you start using it that way, anything that goes wrong with your family, you can blame it on the shaman as casting a spell on you. And they literally killed them all. So it has a shadow side. I'm not sure what the power is, to tell you the truth. I could tell you stories about things that have happened to me and that really jolted me and my reality. But evidently, yeah, if that starts happening, that can happen. But more often than not, the people I met were very respected in their community.
And this example actually reminds me of what I've read and heard from your other documentaries, where having a mentor or having somebody by your side to see you for what you're actually experiencing and then hold your hand through that is absolutely a huge stepping stone. I remember one time you said the example of the older woman and the younger child, how they would spend hours and hours and hours throughout the day together. And of course, from your mind, it was like, why are they spending so much time together? The two totally separate, what do they have in common? And the commonality was, like you said, they were both, the older woman is going back into the spirit world and the younger child is leaving the spirit world.
It just came into the spirit, just came in from the spirit world. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So is that the mentorship and the guidance, is that something that was a repeating link in what you saw?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Typically, the people who took, when somebody would go into one of those states, either having these visions or voices or personality changes or feeling they were dying, thinking they were very sick, typically they would get an older shaman to be their mentor. Sometimes it was a grandmother that was very wise, but often it was an older shaman, somebody who had been through it themselves. And so they knew that territory and they served as a guide for them, taking them through their initiation. And here in the States, we have, and in Europe, of course, in the Western world, we have now a large peer movement where people, much like yourself, serve as a guide for somebody that's a young person that's just entering one of these crises, and can be of great assistance because of that.
And that's a great tool.
Pardon me?
That's a great tool for any of the listeners who are thinking, where can I have some assistance, right? I don't have anyone that's immediate around me.
Yeah. There's an organization out of New Hampshire, I believe, Intentional Peer Support. And they have a good database of people that can help. And on our website, crazywisefilm.com, we have a resource page and where you can access peer information about peers. But it's a very strong movement.
And since fully completing the documentary, you said that now you are really interested in working with neuroscientists and the development of the brain. Is this work also related to what is happening in the brain throughout these experiences, or just overall?
Well, you know, I'm not working with them, but I'm interviewing them to see what they're up to, and reading their papers and listening to their TED Talks. And I've got a couple of them on our website, on the Crazy Wise website. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in that because it has tied together so many things I've heard, and I have a scientific background myself. I mean, in terms of going through a physiology major and then going through dental school, you get a lot of that. And so I really love the fact that I see spirituality and science coming together as they have these new tools to look at the brain and what happens under certain subjective experiences. And so the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging, has allowed scientists to look at blood flow in the brain. And so to look at the change where that blood is, because the brain uses a tremendous amount of energy. People don't realize that, but it uses about 30 to 40% of our total energy. And so it has a huge blood supply. And so when somebody is in a certain state of consciousness, you can measure where that blood is flowing, what parts of the brain. So now they're mapping the brain in a very interesting way. They're mapping it in terms of networks. So when I went to school 1,000 years ago, they mapped the brain in just, this part is the vision center, this part is the auditory center, this is the motor of the hand, blah, blah. You know, it's called the Penfield map. Well, now it's gotten so much more sophisticated that they're measuring these networks, and these networks do interesting things like our sense of time, our sense of self. Where does our sense of self reside in our brain, and how is it built? And it talks about another thing that I find very interesting is what they call predictive coding. So we see the world, and there's, if you go on the internet, you can see various demonstrations of this to prove it to yourself. But we see the world through a lens that is built by our prior experiences. We don't see reality for the raw data coming into us through our five senses. And our interpretation of that data is our reality. It isn't reality. So that is interesting because that predictive coding is also housed in the same network called the default mode network as our sense of time and our sense of self. Our sense of self is really a predictive code. And I'm talking a little bit fast about all this stuff, but without illustrating it, so it may be hard to understand. But that predictive codes, when they disappear, when that default mode network shuts down, can be totally frightening. And like I've had people say, you know, when they've gone into their crisis, their psychological crisis, they would say something like, it was like flying a 747 packed with passengers, and all of a sudden the controls aren't doing what they used to do. And the panic that you would feel being responsible for that plane. And so when that happens, it can be very, very frightening. And I've had people describe it in various ways, what they felt. I had a girlfriend go through it, actually, a long time ago. And she had to stay in our apartment, and she just shook for a week. I mean, she couldn't leave. And she would say things to me like, I don't know where I end and everything else begins. And she was having that, I would call it now, I didn't know what it was back then. And it was like, whoa. I don't think I was as good as your husband, but I think I was good enough that she got through it. But I stayed with her, and yeah, I was curious. I wasn't frightened. I was curious. I think that's what saved the day. But like I was telling you earlier, most people who are heavily invested in the person that's going through it, whether it's their child or their lover or their friend, get frightened. And that's the worst, or worried. And that's the worst state of mind to be in when you're around somebody in that state, because they pick up on it and then they get frightened. But anyway, the default mode network, there's thousands of papers written about it now. It was just discovered in 2001, and it's not that old in terms of but now there's all this interest in it. And they're studying it through using psychedelics. So how can you put somebody in one of these machines and measure the changes that go on like you experienced? And one way is with psychedelics. You know, when psychedelics were first discovered, they were called psychomimetics, mimicking a psychosis. That's what they called them. And eventually they got around to the term psychedelic, which means mind revealing. Because the other thing, the default, and by the way, psychedelics shut down the default mode network. And I believe, although it's never been measured because it would be very unethical to do it, a person going into one of these non-ordinary states or crises. So they've been able to, with psychedelics, mimic what goes on with somebody going through one of these crises. And I believe that because it's so similar. Another thing that shuts down the default mode network, extreme meditation, going on an extreme meditation retreat. And a lot of things can happen in that. You can shut down the default mode network and your predictive codes can start disappearing. And also, the other thing the default mode network does, evidently, it contains, it unites the front part of your frontal lobes with the bacterial part of your brain called the posterior cingulate cortex, along with the brainstem, which houses the limbic system. And that holds your emotional memory. So any childhood traumas that you couldn't resolve because they were too heavy at the time when you had them when you were a kid, those can come up. It's sort of the gatekeeper of those memories, the default mode network. So those can come up when you are in one of these states where it's shut down. And it happens when in people, in our movie, Adam, our main subject, in a Vipassana meditation retreat, which is 10 hours of meditation a day or more, 10 straight days in a row, silent meditation. Images of himself being molested as a child by his granddad came up. So it's all very interesting, what's happening in the world of neuroscience.
So I think it's amazing what you're saying, that there's this blend happening between spirituality and the science fields. And like what we were saying before we came on here, I was explaining to you about my awakening to Lemuria, which to anybody in this reality, it makes absolutely no sense, even to me at the time, because I didn't even know Lemuria existed. So Lemuria was known as the ancient civilization that was connected to more of the spiritual aspect of ourselves. And so Atlantis is known as the ancient civilization that was connected to sciences. And both of these civilizations fell because neither were balanced. And it sounds like to me, which I think is so beautiful, that we have an opportunity here to bring them together. And you've seen it firsthand through your interviews and through the people that you've been exposed to. I can definitely say that I've had some psychedelic experiences with ayahuasca, and it is definitely the same as the experiences that I had. As a matter of fact, once I experienced ayahuasca, I said, I'm never doing this again because I already do it in meditation. And the sensations.
Did it mimic what you went through in your crisis as well? Was it similar to that?
Yes, it was very similar because what plant medicine does, it makes everything very real at the forefront of your experience. So anything that you're not facing, anything that is hidden, like you're saying, these memories in your body that need to be seen and worked through, it all becomes present in the now. Time collapses and you have to be with it, and you can't walk away. You can't run away like in a normal daily basis. Oh, I don't have time for that. I'm just going to go to work. You're in it. Your whole body is shut down. And that's exactly what I would experience in meditation. I experience it still to this day. I'll be guided into excessively deep states of meditation for hours on end. It's just not as constant. I think when it first began, it was daily, back to back all the time. And now it's just a little more, I think when I need a little reminder, I get a little slap from the other side is how I say it.
yeah, these deep states of meditation, I always thought something was being shut down in the mind because you don't have awareness of the space around you, of what time it is, of what day it is. Everything disappears. And all of a sudden, you're just transported into another dimensional reality, and the information that's given, it's not up to you.
Yeah. And were you blindfolded during this time, or were your eyes open?
No, always, since the very first day that I've had these experiences, it would
I
start
mean,
with,
ayahuasca.
oh, ayahuasca, eyes closed, just out of option.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the darkness has a lot to do with the brain, at least in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Just closing the eyes, and actually, I always choose to put on an eye mask. It
Yeah.
helps me just go a little deeper and center into the experience and the information.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Good for you. I know that people like yourself that can go into these non-ordinary, extraordinary states. Sometimes it can be a little dicey to have them do a psychedelic like ayahuasca or LSD or mushrooms. Um, but it sounds like you've got enough of a handle on things that you can handle that.
Oh, I definitely wouldn't do it. I mean, this happened in the very beginning of my process.
Oh, or
I
you ever,
was
the car accident even?
No, actually, after I had already had my awakening, and I thought that turning to the plant medicine would help me understand things, but it didn't really ground the experience. It definitely gave me information, but since then I haven't done it because, like you said, it's I just don't feel like it's necessary, and it's too intense for the mind and the body.
Yeah. And what I've heard is for somebody that has a tendency that can go into those states, somebody like me that can normally, um, I haven't done any for a long time. You know, I have a history of being in the San Francisco Bay Area during the hippie movement and when all the experimentation was. I did experiment a little bit, but I haven't done any of the therapeutic psychedelic trips that are going on now, or the ayahuasca experiences. I filmed them down in the Amazon, but I haven't done it myself. But somebody that has a tendency to go there, it's a little more dangerous because uh, there usually you have to learn how to ground. That's what you've had to learn how to do, right? You've had to learn how to ground yourself when you start going there and your predictive codes start disappearing or whatever is happening. And what brings you back to this reality here? And what I learned from the shaman is somehow, and I don't know what they were taught, to tell you the truth, because when I was doing the interviews with the shaman, I had no idea I'd be doing a film like Crazy Lives. I was a human rights guy. That's what's my main. I just had this side interest. But what the shaman's talent is being able to go into other worlds and come back, to be able to reground themselves. And they're very good at going in and going out of these trance-like states and alternate states of consciousness.
Yeah, and that's
Somebody that isn't can be, you know, they want to ground and they can't get back as easily. They can't themselves.
yeah, and I've definitely experienced that where I couldn't come back, or I didn't know how to, or you don't know. It's the integration, right? And
Yeah.
that's quite a skill. I think I'm still, even to this day, learning and
How did you learn that? How did you learn how to integrate and ground?
that's a good question. For a long time, I didn't. We were living in New York for a long time, so that was very sensibly overloading my system.
Mm.
So the grounding was almost not there, I would say, in New York City. Once I got into Miami, I realized that it was the nature, like just something as simple as putting my feet on the ground and sitting
Mm.
outside in the sun, or for me specifically, nature and water water is a big key element for me.
Got it.
Going into the
That
ocean.
a lot, by the way.
What's that?
I hear that a lot. Nature, grounding, doing gardening, get your fingers in the dirt. Yeah, water. Um, that's very common, a grounding technique.
Sometimes, sometimes it feels like we're just kind of like cell phones, but in a human body. And the earth is our electrical plug. I like to think of it like that, and if we don't plug in often enough, I think some of us will feel the side effects.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I like that you mentioned in one of your interviews, or maybe it was just earlier today, you said we're building in this process a relationship to spirit. I think I might have picked it up from one of your past interviews. And there's this process of doing that, of building a relationship to spirit. Can you share some of the things that you were sharing with me earlier about what are the fundamental things or attributes that make this process a little healthier?
Or easier. You mean,
Easier.
we talked a little bit about, I had to review my list because I always talk about it. The things of people around you that will really be helpful. And so when you're in one of those states, the enemy is isolation. You want to have some personal connection of some sort. And maintaining personal connections. And that goes, and I talked about not having somebody around you who's getting frightened by you. Having a peer, which we've talked about, having somebody who's gone through it is very important. Having a community of people would even be more ideal. And even people that, I get calls a lot from people who've gone through these experiences and they're alone. I just talked to somebody in Portugal yesterday. He's all alone over there. He has nobody to talk to about what he's gone through. He happened to see one of my TED Talks. And so that's what I recommended. Get in touch with a peer community in Portugal or a group of people that have gone through this and are talking about it. And that's very important. And of course, the basics. Make sure you're getting enough sleep, nutrition, and exercise, and being in nature. And yeah, like we said, I mentioned like what your husband was, light and funny, not worried. You want to be around people like that. They don't have to, they could be like me. I've never had that experience, but they need to be light and not be in a serious, worried mood. That doesn't work. So those are the things. Is that what you were getting at? The things that are helpful to be around when you're in a non-ordinary state for the first time, especially.
Yeah, or just dealing with this process. I'm seeing a lot of people now, especially in Hawaii, because people feel they have a lot of memories come up in their body when they visit Hawaii and they experience, for example, I'll be driving in the mountains and my whole body will start shaking and sometimes I'll start crying and I'll have memories come up and it's like, what is happening? If I didn't have my past experiences, I would think I'm going crazy, right? So I think all of these things that you just mentioned now really help to just be receptive and really take care of the mind and the body and ground and eat well. And all of these things really do make a difference when you start to experience something that's completely out of left field and not normal.
Yeah. And did I talk about the things that didn't help in our interview here, or did I talk about it before we got on the air?
I know you said being in fear.
The paradigm by which our mental health system looks at these experiences as pathology, as a chemical imbalance of the brain. Have we talked about that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
How it's completely off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very important one. I wanted to make sure I got that one in because that's a mistake that's made over and over. And like one of the people in our film, Will Hall, he said, when I went in there and they told me I had this chemical imbalance in my brain and better reduce all my expectations of the goals I had set for myself, because there's no cure for it, and I'll be on these meds for the rest of my life. He said, that was just like somebody casting a spell on me. You know, here's this authority figure that has all the answers and casting this spell on me to keep me in that state of thinking I'm broken. And that's one of the big things that happen to people in that state that is so harmful. And it's still happening a lot today.
Yeah, and it's so easy to believe that when you're in that state because you're just so susceptible to anything that anybody around you will say. So I think it's really important to only share with the people that you feel are receptive and able to support you through the process.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. I loved our conversation today. Do you have any final thoughts or words as to our new generation? I am seeing a lot of people awakening now, especially even what has happened this year specifically. I think people have been forced to have their own mini awakenings.
Yeah.
And do you have how do you see us creating a healthier platform, or how do you see us moving forward in a more balanced way where we can integrate spirituality and science in our Western world, given what you've learned from all of these communities and scientists?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, what we're going through now, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, right? And it's disrupted a lot of things. It's put a lot of people into a crisis situation. And just like a personal crisis, much like you went through, we're going through a collective crisis. And in any crisis, there's opportunity. There's opportunity for growth in any crisis, I think. And so now we're presented with an opportunity, you know, slow down. You know, as I told you, I'm looking at this manuscript of my life right now. And I'm looking back and I'm saying, my God, I was frenetic. I would get home and I was home for 3 days and I'd jet off somewhere else to do my work in another part of the world. And for the last, since February, I've been home in one place. And it's given me time to reflect and really think about all these things I've been exposed to. I've been so fortunate to have all this exposure that has really been my personal spiritual journey. So I think that's one of the things I've learned. I think we can all learn. You know, I do meditate every day, but only about 30 minutes. But to sit still and not be so distracted by everything in our daily lives, set aside some time to be still and just be present in that stillness is a very important thing. But in terms of our collective crisis, to have us all slow down in this economy that's eaten up the environment, to have it slow down is not a tragedy. I know it's difficult on some people more than others, and that's really unfortunate. But I think it's going to be necessary, and we've got these major crises to solve as a species if we're going to maintain our existence, really, in terms of climate change and now the pandemic and polarization, you know, being, you know, and the internet's responsible for a lot of this. We get in these silos of information and belief, and pretty soon my silo doesn't agree with your silo and we're at each other's throats. Look at our election right now. And so we've got these problems to solve and think about, and just slowing down and really thinking about them and what are the solutions. Other than that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think if we all did that, right? If we all did that,
Yeah.
even like you said, 30 minutes a day in meditation, being more present, slowing down, we would find more creative ways to come together, to find that balance between spirituality and science, right? Lemuria, Atlantis, just bringing back together our true potential as a human being, and supporting each and every one of us for our own journeys and the stories that we're living.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to speak to you. Do you have
I
anything
can
else
say
that
the
you?
same. Very much
Yeah.
an honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
to speak with people that have had these experiences and are now, like yourself, putting it out there for the benefit of others. And yeah, like you say, so many more people are going through it. So you're really providing a wonderful service. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And with that, we will close today's episode of Grounding Ascension. Until next time,
Aloha.
aloha.